My name is Kat Garcia, and I'm 34 years old. It was a brisk Tuesday morning in October 2024. I was at my desk, engrossed in a logistics report, when my cell phone rang. A loan officer from a local title company. He sounded cheerful. He asked to confirm my bank routing number for a supposed wire transfer of $650,000. "Congratulations on the sale of your home, Mrs. Garcia," he chirped. Before I tell you what I said to that banker and how I systematically dismantled my husband's life, piece by piece, welcome to Luke Revenge Start. If you know what it's like to be the reliable one who always gets taken for granted, drop your age in the comments right now because this story is for you. I sat rigid in my office chair. That house wasn't for sale. I had purchased that 3-bedroom property in Wilmington, Delaware, entirely with my own savings, 2 years before I even met my husband, Derek. The hardwood floors, the upgraded kitchen, the bay window overlooking the street, they were mine. Derek is 35. He fancies himself a tech entrepreneur. In our 6 years together, that title meant he chased startup unicorns and spent his days networking in coffee shops. Meanwhile, I worked 50-hour weeks as an operations manager, paid our mortgage, funded our groceries. I was the safety net. He was the visionary. The banker waited, assuming I was thrilled about the incoming funds. A chilling sensation spread from my stomach to my fingertips. My voice dropped an octave. I informed the loan officer that I had not authorized any sale of my property. I instructed him to freeze the transaction immediately and to email me every scrap of documentation they had on file. The banker's cheerful tone vanished. He stammered an apology and promised to halt the wire. I hung up and placed the phone face down on my wooden desk. My hands trembled, but not a single tear fell. The math clicked in my head. A $650,000 real estate transaction requires deeds, signatures, and intimate knowledge of my personal details. There was only one person on Earth with unhindered access to my primary identification documents. I was sharing a bed with a man trying to liquidate my entire life. The metallic click of a key in the front door shattered the silence. The familiar jingle of Derek's keychain echoed down the hall, followed by the heavy thud of his expensive leather briefcase on the entryway floor. His footsteps moved closer to my home office. I had a fraction of a second to decide. I could confront him now and watch him weave a web of lies. Or I could smile, play the supportive wife, and hunt for the evidence to bury him. I chose the smile. I smoothed my expression into the blank, neutral mask of a supportive spouse. Just as the front door swung open, Derek stepped into the foyer, carrying the scent of roasted peanuts, lime, and chili. He held up a brown paper bag from my favorite Thai restaurant on Market Street. He flashed his signature boyish grin, the one that used to make me forget how much money he'd lost on his last venture, the one currently attempting to blind me to the fact he was liquidating my life. I walked over and took the bag from him. It was warm against my skin. I thanked him, playing the part of the tired but grateful wife just home from the logistics firm. In our 6 years together, I had learned my husband's unique language of bribes. Derek never bought spontaneous takeout unless he wanted something, or unless he was hiding something. Tonight, he was doing both. He followed me into the kitchen. My kitchen, which I'd paid to have remodeled last spring. He leaned against the marble island, watching me plate the food. He poured 2 glasses of white wine. He looked so at ease, so completely comfortable in the home he was actively trying to sell out from under me. We sat down on the bar stools. I picked up my fork and twirled the noodles. They tasted like wet cardboard, but I forced myself to chew. "How was your day?" I asked, keeping my voice light, interested. Derek lit up. He launched into a spiel about his new logistics application, peppering his talk with words like synergy, disruptive, and seed capital. He sounded like a walking corporate brochure. In his mind, he was already the CEO of a multi-million-dollar empire. In reality, He hadn't drawn a steady paycheck in 3 years. I listened, all the while analyzing his body language. He tapped his fork against his plate. He avoided direct eye contact when he got to the financial part of his pitch. Then, he dropped the bait. He took a sip of wine and glanced at the wall behind me. "My lead investors are getting aggressive," he said casually. "To secure the next round of funding, I need to show personal liquidity." He paused, letting the silence stretch across the kitchen. I knew what he was waiting for. He was waiting for me to offer my savings or suggest taking out a loan. When I remained silent, he shifted in his seat. He leaned forward, lowering his voice into that gentle, persuasive tone he'd perfected over the years. "We need to think about restructuring some of our assets to free up capital," he said, using the word "our." He claimed it was just a temporary reallocation to guarantee our future. He painted a picture of early retirement, a beach house, never worrying about money again. I looked at the man across from me. He was testing my compliance. He was checking the perimeter to see if I was suspicious about the $650,000 wire transfer the title company had almost initiated that afternoon. If I argued, if I questioned him, he would know the bank had called me. So, I nodded. I swallowed the dry noodles and took a slow sip of wine. "You're the visionary of this family," I told him. "I trust your financial instincts. Whatever restructuring you need to do is fine with me, as long as we're building our future together." The physical relief that washed over his face was immediate. His shoulders dropped. He smiled and reached across the marble counter to squeeze my hand. "You're the best partner a man could ask for," he said. My stomach churned, but I kept the smile plastered on my face. He bought the performance. Dinner concluded. He gathered the plates and loaded the dishwasher, whistling a tune under his breath. He kissed my forehead and announced he was going upstairs for a shower before we watched a movie. I watched him leave the kitchen, listening to his footsteps on the hardwood stairs. I waited until I heard the distinct groan of the master bathroom pipes and the rush of water hitting the shower floor. My smile vanished. The timer had started. I stood up and walked down the hall to his home office. It was a room I rarely entered. Derek called it his sanctuary. I called it the place where my paycheck went to die. The room smelled of expensive cologne and leather. A sleek, modern desk sat in the center, devoid of any actual work. I walked straight to the bottom right drawer. It was the only one in the house he kept locked. He kept the master key on his car ring, but I'm an operations manager. My entire career is built on knowing where backups are kept. Derek was predictable. He liked the illusion of security, but he hated inconvenience. I dropped to my knees and ran my hand under the center console of the desk. My fingers brushed against a piece of heavy-duty tape. I peeled it back. A small brass key fell into my palm. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy click. I pulled the drawer open. It was meticulously organized. Files for his old, failed startups. Folders with credit card statements I'd never seen. But at the very back, wedged behind a stack of blank printer paper, was a thick red folder. I pulled it out and laid it on the pristine glass surface of his desk. My hands were steady now. The initial shock from the banker's call had burned off, leaving behind a cold, clinical focus. I opened the red cover. The first page was a standard real estate disclosure form. The property address listed was my home. The second page was a deed of trust, transferring ownership to a man named Arthur Sterling. I recognized the name. Sterling was a local venture capitalist Derek had been trying to court for months. I flipped to the third document. It was a specific power of attorney granting Derek full legal authority to execute real estate transactions on my behalf. I scanned the dense legal paragraphs until I reached the bottom of the page. There, on the signature line where my name belonged, was a forgery. I stared at it. It was an insultingly bad forgery. It looked like a child had tried to trace my handwriting while riding in the back of a moving vehicle. The slant was forced. The loops on my letters were entirely wrong. Derek hadn't even practiced. He'd just scrawled my name, assuming I'd never see it, assuming the title company wouldn't look closely enough, assuming my role as the quiet, reliable wife meant I was invisible. Beside the forged signature was a bright blue circular stamp. It was a formal notary seal. I read the name inside the circle. Someone had legally sworn they witnessed me sign this document. The date on the stamp was October 3rd, 2 weeks ago. He had planned this for 2 weeks. He had sat across from me at the breakfast table, asked me to pass the coffee, and known he had already signed away the walls around us. The pipes in the walls groaned, the water upstairs shutting off abruptly. I froze, my lungs constricted. He was out of the shower early. I heard the bathroom door swing open. I heard the slap of his wet bare feet on the upstairs hardwood. Then the sound of his footsteps moving toward the staircase. I had seconds. I shoved the forged documents back into the red folder. I pushed the folder to the back of the drawer. I slammed the drawer shut and turned the key. I ripped another piece of tape from the dispenser on his desk, pressed the spare key back under the center console, and stood up. I needed a reason to be in his sanctuary. My eyes scanned the desk. An old white phone charging cable lay tangled near the base of his monitor. I grabbed it, wrapping the cord around my fingers just as a shadow fell across the office threshold. Derek stood in the doorway. He was dripping wet. A white towel was wrapped tight around his waist. His posture was rigid. His eyes tracked from my face to the desk, to the locked drawer, and back to my face. The relaxed, confident man from the kitchen was gone. He looked like an animal caught in a snare. "What are you doing in my office?" he asked, his voice tight, sharp. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice came out smooth, bored even. I held up the tangled white charging cord. "My phone battery died and I couldn't find my charger in the living room," I said. I forced a small, apologetic laugh. "Do you mind if I borrow your spare cord for the night?" I stood there holding the plastic wire, daring him to accuse me of something else. I watched the calculation happen in his head. I watched him weigh the risk of pressing the issue against the relief of a simple explanation. The tension drained from his shoulders. He let out a breath he'd been holding. He smiled, running a hand through his wet hair. "Keep the charger," he said. "I'll be down in a minute to pick out a movie." He turned and walked away. I stood in the center of the dark office, gripping the white wire until my knuckles turned white. He thought he was safe. He thought he had outsmarted the system and outsmarted his wife. He thought I was just looking for a battery charge. But the countdown had officially begun. I was no longer sharing a home with a dreamer. I was sleeping next to a felon. And tomorrow morning, I was going to find out exactly how deep his crimes went. The next morning, my phone alarm blared at 6 a.m. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan while Derek snored softly beside me. The man breathing rhythmically into his pillow was not my husband anymore. He was an active threat. He was a hostile entity operating within my home. I needed to move fast, and I needed an ally who understood the mechanics of financial destruction. I slipped out of bed, grabbed my laptop bag, and drove to a small, independent coffee shop on the edge of Wilmington. It was a place Derek never frequented because the espresso was cheap and the aesthetics were terrible. I parked my car and dialed a number I had memorized 15 years ago. Valerie picked up on the second ring. Valerie and I had been roommates during our undergraduate years at the University of Delaware. While I pursued logistics, she double majored in accounting and criminal justice. Today, Valerie is a senior corporate compliance auditor for a multinational firm. She is the woman executives fear when discrepancies appear in quarterly reports. She reads bank statements the way other people read suspense novels. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told her I needed her to look at something off the record, and I needed her there in 20 minutes. Valerie arrived looking sharp in a tailored gray suit, holding a massive travel mug of black coffee. She sat down across from me in the corner booth. I opened my laptop and slid it toward her. I explained the phone call from the title company. I described the forged deed I had found in Derek's locked drawer. I told her the sale was for $650,000. Valerie didn't gasp. She didn't offer me platitudes or ask how I was feeling. She simply set down her coffee, cracked her knuckles, and pulled my laptop closer. This was why I'd called her. I didn't need emotional support. I needed a forensic strike. She asked for Derek's primary email address and his known passwords. I gave her the list. Derek was lazy with his digital security. He reused the same variations of his birth year and his favorite sports team across multiple platforms. Valerie opened a secured terminal window on her own tablet and began typing. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She bypassed his sloppy two-factor authentication by mirroring his primary device, an old trick we used to bypass campus internet restrictions back in the day. Within 15 minutes, she had cracked the surface of his shadow life. She accessed his primary business accounts, the ones he claimed were tied up in venture capital funds. The screen illuminated a financial crater so deep it made my stomach drop. Derek hadn't just made a few bad investments. He had obliterated everything he touched. The ledger showed a series of catastrophic margin calls from a disastrous cryptocurrency collapse that occurred early in 2024. He had pursued a volatile altcoin, borrowing money he didn't possess. When the market plummeted, the platform liquidated his holdings, leaving him with hundreds of thousands in unsecured debt. Valerie meticulously traced the escalating demands, realizing the creditors were closing in. The aggressive investors Derek had casually mentioned over pad thai the previous night were, in fact, aggressive collection agencies poised to initiate asset seizures. He wasn't selling my house to fund a new logistics venture. He was selling it to staunch the financial hemorrhage. I stared at the cascading red numbers on the screen. 6 years. 6 years of enduring his pitches, believing in his potential, and covering the mortgage so he could focus on the grand vision. That grand vision, it turned out, was a fraudulent Ponzi scheme propped up by my unwavering financial stability. Valerie then paused her scrolling, highlighting a specific entry on the digital ledger. Her voice, usually dispassionate, lost its detachment. Pointing to the screen, she urged me to carefully examine one specific transaction. It was a bank transfer, initiated exactly 14 days ago, on October the 1st. The amount, a fixed amount of $50,000. The recipient was neither a collection agency nor a cryptocurrency exchange. The destination account belonged to Richard and Susan, Derek's parents. I sank back into the vinyl booth, the ambient noise of the coffee shop fading to a dull hum. 50,000. Richard and Susan lived in an upscale apartment complex in Houseville. Richard, a retired regional sales director, relished discussions about his golf handicap. Susan, a woman who orchestrated charity galas, often reminded me that Derek hailed from a family of visionaries. They drove leased luxury vehicles and indulged in annual vacations to the Amalfi Coast, projecting an image of generational wealth. However, true wealth doesn't typically necessitate sudden $50,000 infusions from a son with no verifiable income. Valerie tapped the screen again, explaining the transfer's mechanics. Derek had secured a high-interest short-term bridge loan, leveraging the impending sale of my house as collateral. The title company, anticipating the closing, had advanced him a portion of the equity. He had taken this advance and wired it directly to his parents, bleeding my equity to finance his illusions and his family. I met Valerie's gaze. Her expression was grim. She posed the question already burning in my mind. Did Richard and Susan know where that money came from? I recalled our last family dinner. Susan had complimented the expensive watch Derek had gifted her for her birthday. Richard had clapped Derek on the back, praising his business acumen. They had looked at me with that familiar, condescending warmth reserved for the steadfast, reliable pack mule carrying the family's burdens. If they believed Derek to be a successful entrepreneur, they might have accepted the money, assuming it was the fruits of his labor, potentially innocent beneficiaries of his elaborate con. But if they knew the truth, that his businesses were bankrupt, that he possessed zero liquidity, then they knew the only asset capable of generating $50,000 in cash was the 3-bedroom house registered in my name. I closed my laptop, the hinge snapping shut with a report like a gunshot in the quiet corner booth. I told Valerie I needed to ascertain the depth of the deception, whether I was confronting a single individual or an entire family. Valerie nodded, packing her tablet, promising to continue monitoring the accounts and trace every destination of the misappropriated funds. I exited the coffee shop into the bright October sunlight. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from Derek. He was checking in, asking if I could stop by early, mentioning a surprise and promising an incredible weekend. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenching at the sheer audacity of his message. He was orchestrating a charade while actively dismantling my financial future. I typed back a cheerful confirmation of my arrival. Sliding the phone back into my pocket, I noted that the first phase was complete. I had the bank logs, the evidence of his crypto collapse, and the wire transfer records. Still, documents alone were insufficient. I needed a confession to hear the truth directly from the enablers' mouths. I envisioned standing in the pristine kitchen of Richard and Susan's Hawesville home, confronting them directly. Walking to my car, a cold, precise plan began to form. Derek believed he controlled the narrative, that he was managing his naive wife. He had no inkling that he had just handed the blueprint of his downfall to an operations manager specializing in systemic deconstruction. The drive to the affluent suburb of Greenville, a 45-minute journey, felt like traversing into another dimension as the landscape shifted. The modest, practical neighborhoods of Wilmington gave way to winding roads canopied by ancient oaks, with properties concealed behind towering wrought iron gates. Derek had texted me the address of the rental property earlier that morning, citing a desire to host the ultimate startup launch party to impress his new investors, calling it a temporary lease to project success. I knew it was fraudulent theater, funded by the stolen equity of my home. I pulled my practical sedan onto a quiet side street, parking 2 blocks from the address, wanting to approach unannounced, to avoid Derek hearing my car. I strolled down the manicured sidewalk, the crisp October air chilling through my thin jacket. The house Derek had selected was a sprawling faux chateau, complete with 4 massive columns framing the entryway, a circular driveway paved with imported stone, and a ridiculous tiered fountain on the central lawn, a monument to unearned wealth. As I neared the property, voices echoed from the backyard. I walked softly across the lawn, staying close to the tall hedge separating the estate from its neighbors. Peeking through the leaves, I saw Derek on the expansive flagstone patio, dressed in a tailored suit. He gestured animatedly at a team of caterers arranging high-top tables and floral displays, loudly dictating the placement of champagne flutes like a demanding billionaire. The scene turned my stomach. He was a bankrupt man directing a symphony of lies upon the ashes of my financial stability. Turning away from the patio, I approached the side of the house. A heavy wooden service door stood slightly ajar, propped open by a caterer's supply crate. I slipped inside, entering a spacious mudroom. The air was thick with the scent of fresh paint, citrus cleaning supplies, and roasting garlic. Moving silently down the hallway, my rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the polished hardwood floors, I reached a cavernous chef's kitchen. I stopped, pressing my back against the wall. Voices drifted from the room's center, the sharp, cultured tones of my mother-in-law, Susan, and the low, hesitant baritone of my father-in-law, Richard. I needed to uncover the full extent of the rot. I needed to know if they were unwitting beneficiaries of Derek and his elaborate con, or if they were active participants. Taking a slow breath, I slid my feet across the tile and eased myself into the walk-in pantry, situated just off the main kitchen. It was a pantry the size of my actual bedroom, with floor-to-ceiling shelves laden with artisanal olive oils, imported pastas, and jars of preserves. I retreated into the shadows behind a metal rack of baking supplies. Through the frosted glass of the pantry door, I could discern their blurred silhouettes near the massive marble island. Richard sighed, the sound of ice clinking against crystal echoing in the vast kitchen. He poured himself another drink, leaning against the counter. He voiced his concern to Susan about the caterer's exorbitant costs, sounding distinctly nervous. "They're burning through cash," he admitted, "and the optics of this entire weekend make me uncomfortable." Susan clicked her tongue, a sharp, dismissive sound I'd heard countless times. For 6 years, she had coordinated local charity galas and leased the least expensive luxury sedans, all while looking down her nose at my operations manager's salary. She always treated me like a sturdy workhorse, lacking the visionary brilliance of her son. She told Richard to stop pacing and drink his scotch, insisting the party was an investment and Derek needed to look the part to secure the venture capital. Richard lowered his voice, inquiring about the money. "What about the $50,000 wire transfer that hit our account 2 weeks ago?" he asked, adding that the bridge loan felt dangerous and he was worried about their legal exposure. He posed the question directly. "Is Kat going to find out about the real estate transfer before the house officially closes?" My heart thudded against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain shallow and silent. I reached into my jacket pocket, retrieved my smartphone, swiped the screen open, tapped the voice memo application, and pressed the red circular button to begin recording. The digital timer started ticking upward, capturing every word that echoed off the kitchen tiles. Susan laughed, a light, breezy sound, utterly devoid of guilt or hesitation. She took a sip of her wine, setting the glass down on the marble counter. "Stop acting like a coward," she told her husband. "Kat's too busy working 50 hours a week to notice a stack of legal documents." Susan declared that Derek had done exactly what was necessary to save his business and their retirement accounts. Richard argued weakly, pointing out that forging a signature on a power of attorney was a federal crime. "If Kat checks the county property records," he warned, "the entire family could face indictment." Susan scoffed, her voice cutting through the air, sharp and unapologetic. The audio captured her tone with perfect clarity. "Lower your voice," she commanded. "The girl is his wife. When you marry into a family, your assets belong to that family." Susan explained that Derek had to protect his parents because his wife lacked the vision to support his empire. "He did what he had to do with that paperwork," she concluded. "The $50,000 was simply their rightful share of the equity." Susan added that Kat would eventually get over the shock once the new startup launched and made them all millionaires. I stood in the dark pantry, surrounded by imported groceries, as my reality fractured and reassembled into something cold and sharp. They knew. They hadn't merely accepted stolen money, they knew about the forged signature, the fraudulent power of attorney. They actively encouraged the theft, viewing my life, my labor, and my property as their personal treasury. The recording ticked past the 2-minute mark. Richard murmured his agreement, took another sip of scotch, and expressed hope that the title company would finalize the remaining funds by Monday so they could pay off their country club dues. My blood ran cold, but my resolve hardened into steel. I wasn't fighting a misguided husband struggling with a failed business. I was fighting an organized family theft ring. They had stripped me to the studs to fund their illusion of high society wealth. I tapped the red square on my phone screen. The recording stopped. The audio file saved automatically to my secure cloud storage. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I had the weapon, the irrefutable proof of their complicity. I waited until Susan announced she was going out to the patio to check on the floral arrangements. The kitchen door swung open and closed. Richard followed her outside, leaving the kitchen empty. I stepped out of the pantry. The air in the kitchen felt heavy. I walked swiftly back down the hallway, slipped through the mudroom, and exited the side service door. The cool October wind hit my face, clearing my head. I walked briskly around the perimeter of the sprawling estate, following the tall hedge until I reached the front gate. I needed to make an entrance. I needed to feign arriving, fresh from a long day at the office, oblivious to the financial execution unfolding behind the scenes. I walked up the circular driveway, my heels clicking loudly against the imported stone. Reaching the massive oak front doors, I pushed them open. The grand foyer featured a sweeping double staircase and a crystal chandelier that caught the late afternoon sunlight. Derek heard the doors open. He emerged into the foyer from the back patio, his face flushed with stress and adrenaline. The moment he saw me, his entire demeanor shifted. He smoothed his tie, plastered on his signature boyish grin, and approached me with his arms open, kissing my cheek. He smelled of expensive cologne and desperation. He welcomed me to our new temporary castle, thanking me for coming early to help manage the final details before the investors arrived. I smiled back, my facial muscles obeying my commands perfectly. "The house is stunning," I said, "and I'm so proud of your vision. What do you need me to do to help set up?" Derek ran a hand through his hair. "Everything's mostly under control with the caterers," he said, "but there's one small administrative task I need to handle before the party starts. My new business bank account requires a final security clearance to process the seed capital from our lead investor." He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a sleek silver tablet, and tapped the screen, bringing up an application with a dark blue interface. He looked at me with bright, innocent eyes. "I just need you to complete a quick biometric identity scan," he said, calling it a routine spousal compliance check. He held the tablet out toward me, the front-facing camera already active. I looked at the screen. I recognized the interface immediately. I drew a slow breath, slid my feet across the cold tile, and slipped into the walk-in pantry beside the main kitchen. The room was larger than my apartment bedroom. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, lined with imported olive oils, handmade pasta, and rows of expensive preserves. I moved deeper into the darkness behind a rack stacked with baking supplies. Through the frosted glass door, I could make out their blurred figures standing beside the enormous marble island. Richard exhaled heavily. Ice clinked against crystal somewhere in the cavernous kitchen. He poured another drink and leaned against the counter. He told Susan the catering bill was getting out of control. His voice carried tension. He said they were bleeding cash, and the image they were trying to maintain this weekend made him uneasy. Susan clicked her tongue, sharp and dismissive. I had heard that sound for years. For 6 straight years she organized charity galas and drove entry-level luxury sedans while treating my operations manager's salary like it was beneath her. To her, I was dependable muscle without the brilliance her son supposedly possessed. She told Richard to stop pacing and finish his scotch. She said the party was an investment. Derek needed to look successful if he wanted to attract venture capital. Richard lowered his voice. He asked about the money. Specifically, the $50,000 wire transfer deposited 2 weeks earlier. He admitted the bridge loan felt risky and worried aloud about legal consequences. Then he asked the question directly. Would Kat discover the real estate transfer before the closing paperwork finalized? My pulse slammed against my ribs, but I forced myself to stay still and silent. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and opened the voice memo app. I pressed the red record button. The timer began counting upward, capturing every word bouncing across the kitchen tile. Susan laughed softly, calm and completely free of guilt. She sipped her wine and rested the glass on the marble countertop. She told her husband to stop acting scared. Kat was too busy working 50-hour weeks to notice legal paperwork disappearing in front of her face. Susan said Derek had simply done what was necessary to save the business and protect their retirement accounts. Richard pushed back weakly. Forging a signature on a power of attorney was a federal crime. If Kat checked county records, the entire family could be indicted. Susan scoffed again. Her voice sliced through the room, cold and unapologetic, perfectly preserved by my recording. She told Richard to lower his voice. Kat was his wife, and according to Susan, once you married into a family, your assets belong to that family too. She claimed Derek was protecting his parents because his wife lacked the vision to support his empire. The forged paperwork was justified. The $50,000 was simply their rightful share of the equity. Then she added that Kat would calm down eventually once the startup succeeded and made them all rich. I stood frozen in that dark pantry surrounded by imported groceries, while my entire reality split apart and rebuilt itself into something colder. They knew, not only about the stolen money, about the forged signature, about the fake power of attorney. They encouraged it because they saw my life, my work, and my property as resources they were entitled to use. The recording passed the 2-minute mark. Richard quietly agreed. He took another sip of scotch and said he hoped the title company released the remaining funds by Monday so they could pay their overdue country club fees. The chill that moved through me hardened into resolve. I was not dealing with a struggling husband making bad choices. I was dealing with a family operation built around theft. They had stripped my finances apart to maintain the illusion of wealth and status. I stopped the recording. The file uploaded automatically to secure cloud storage. I slid the phone back into my pocket. Now I had proof. I waited until Susan announced she was going outside to inspect the floral arrangements on the patio. The kitchen door opened and shut. Richard followed her, leaving the room empty. I stepped out of the pantry. The kitchen air felt heavy as concrete. I moved quickly down the hallway, crossed through the mudroom, and slipped outside through the service entrance. Cold October wind hit my face and cleared my thoughts instantly. I walked along the edge of the estate beside the tall hedges until I reached the front gate. I needed to stage an entrance. I needed to look like I had just arrived from work, completely unaware of the financial execution unfolding behind closed doors. I crossed the circular driveway, my heels striking imported stone loud enough to echo. At the massive oak doors, I paused briefly before pushing them open. The foyer looked like something ripped from a luxury magazine. A sweeping double staircase curved beneath a crystal chandelier glowing in the late afternoon light. Derek heard me enter. He walked in from the patio looking flushed with stress, but the second he saw me, his entire expression transformed. He straightened his tie, flashed his practiced grin, and opened his arms as he approached. He kissed my cheek. He smelled like expensive cologne and panic. He welcomed me to our temporary castle and thanked me for arriving early to help manage final details before investors showed up. I smiled back flawlessly. I told him the house looked incredible and that I was proud of his vision. Then I asked what he needed me to handle. Derek dragged a hand through his hair and said most things were under control, but there was one small administrative task left before the party started. According to him, the new business account needed one final security clearance before the seed funding could be released. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek silver tablet. One tap brought up a dark blue interface. Then he looked at me with bright, innocent eyes and explained that he only needed me to complete a quick biometric identity scan. A routine compliance check for spouses, he said. He held the tablet toward me. The front camera was already active. I looked at the screen and recognized the software immediately. It was not a banking application. It was the digital verification portal used by Secure Title National, one of the largest escrow services on the East Coast. This was the final step needed to release $650,000 of my stolen equity. The forged deed was already in place. The fake power of attorney had already been submitted. All he still needed was biometric confirmation from the primary asset holder. Me. The countdown had ended, and Derek had just handed me the trigger. The massive oak doors closed behind us, muting the sounds of caterers working outside on the patio. The foyer smelled of expensive wax polish and floral arrangements worth more than my first car. Derek stood in front of me, holding the tablet with the relaxed confidence of someone convinced victory was already secured. I stared at the glowing screen. Dark blue background, circular facial capture frame, rotating loading icon in the upper corner. Most people might have believed his story about standard banking verification. I did not. I managed operations for a logistics company that handled thousands of secure vendor transactions every quarter. I recognized the software instantly. This was the final lock standing between his fraudulent paperwork and the $650,000 transfer. He leaned forward and kissed my cheek again. His lips felt cold. He smiled warmly and called me a team player, said he could always rely on me to support the vision. 6 years of loyalty weaponized into the final tool needed to rob me. Anger surged through my chest so hard I nearly shattered the tablet against the marble floor. I wanted to expose him right there in the foyer. I wanted the caterers to stop working and his parents to come running while I tore apart the illusion they had built. But rage would not recover my house. Rage would only give him time to lie. I needed precision instead. I forced the anger down and buried it beneath cold logic. Then I took the tablet from his hands. The device felt heavier than it should have. I lifted it to eye level. The circular frame pulsed, waiting for a face. My reflection stared back at me. Steady eyes, tight jaw. A woman preparing to dismantle an empire built on fraud. Derek hovered beside me, eager for the confirmation screen. He told me to stay still while the software scanned my features. I needed the verification to fail, but it had to look accidental. I waited until the progress bar reached 80%. Then, just as the system initiated final biometric capture, I shifted my weight and let my hand jerk downward. The camera angle dropped. Instead of my face, it caught the edge of my chin and a blurred section of chandelier overhead. The progress bar froze. The circular frame flashed bright red. A digital voice announced an identity verification mismatch. I gasped and lowered the tablet, pretending embarrassment. I apologized immediately, blaming my grip and the weight of the device. I joked about being terrible with technology, something he had criticized throughout our marriage countless times. Derek groaned. Not annoyed, terrified. The polished entrepreneur mask slipped away for one brief second, revealing the desperate man underneath. He grabbed the tablet from my hands and stared at the red warning screen, jaw clenched tight. He hit retry. A new message appeared. Biometric verification locked due to suspected security breach. Please contact customer support during regular business hours. Regular business hours. Friday evening. The title company would not reopen until Monday morning. The realization hit him visibly. Color drained from his face. The $650,000 was frozen in escrow. No access to the money. No ability to cover crypto losses. No ability to impress investors arriving the next day. He cursed quietly under his breath and dragged a hand through his carefully styled hair. Then he started pacing the foyer, muttering about incompetent software and broken systems. I watched him unravel while maintaining the expression of a supportive wife. I asked whether everything was okay. I asked if the delay would affect the startup funding. He stopped pacing and forced a strained smile. Just a small administrative issue, he claimed. He would call Monday morning and handle everything, but his eyes betrayed him. Pure panic. I nodded like I believed every word. Then I told him I was sure he would fix it because he always did. I touched his arm gently, offered hollow reassurance, and excused myself to check the dining room arrangements. I left him alone in the foyer with a locked tablet and a collapsing empire. The biometric trap had failed. I had bought 48 hours. 48 hours to locate the weakest link in his fraud chain. 48 hours to gather enough evidence to bring the entire operation down legally. I needed the notary. The forged power of attorney hidden in his desk carried a blue notary seal. Someone had officially sworn they watched me sign documents I had never seen. That meant one of two things. Either the notary had been deceived too, or they were an accomplice. As I walked toward the dining room, I pulled out my phone and opened the secure messaging app. I texted Valerie immediately. Biometric scan blocked. Funds frozen until Monday. Shift focus. I need the name, address, and background of the notary tied to the fraudulent documents. Valerie replied within 30 seconds. Thumbs up emoji. Results within the hour. I slipped my phone away and entered the formal dining room. The room was enormous. A polished mahogany table stretched nearly the full length of the space while caterers arranged white orchids and silver candelabras across the surface. I walked over to a stack of white linen napkins and began folding them. The repetitive movement steadied me. My mind continued racing. If the notary knowingly participated, they would already have a prepared story. But Derrick was not some mastermind criminal. He was desperate, drowning in debt, impulsive and careless. He would not hire professionals. He would use someone easy to manipulate. My phone vibrated against my hip. I pulled it out immediately. Valerie had sent a secure file. I opened the dossier. The notary was not an experienced attorney working in a downtown office. His name was Jason Miller, 23 years old. Recent communications graduate. Current position: unpaid administrative intern at a logistics startup. Derrick's logistics startup. The final pieces snapped together into a clear and devastating picture. Derrick had not hired some professional criminal to forge documents. He had pressured a terrified intern. He used his position, his authority, and the promise of a future career to force a young employee into certifying fraudulent paperwork. Jason Miller was the weak point, the key that could crack the entire conspiracy open. I closed the dossier and sent Valerie a short reply. We found our target. Track his current location. We're paying the intern a visit. I lifted my eyes from the phone. Through the enormous windows overlooking the driveway, I watched Derrick pacing across the stone pavers with his phone pressed tightly against his ear. Rage twisted his face. Panic radiated from every movement. He was probably screaming at an automated customer service line, trying to override the security lock on the title company portal. He was fighting a war he could not win. What Derrick did not realize was that the true threat was not a software malfunction. The real threat was standing inside the dining room watching him unravel while preparing to dismantle his life piece by stolen piece. I found him again in the grand foyer, still staring at the locked silver tablet like a man watching his final escape route disappear beneath the water. I approached carefully, softening my expression into the image of a supportive and oblivious wife. I told him I needed to drive back to our house in Wilmington to pick up my Navy formal suit for tomorrow's party along with a few extra supplies. He barely listened. He muttered distracted approval and waved me toward the door while dialing another number on his phone. He was trapped inside a digital cage built by his own greed. I stepped out of the rented chateau and climbed into my practical sedan. The moment the heavy oak doors shut behind me, the performance disappeared. The concerned wife vanished. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and rolled the window down, letting cold night air flood the car as I drove away from the manicured streets of the wealthy neighborhood. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. Valerie had sent a location pin. Jason Miller was sitting at a coffee shop near the university campus. 23 years old. First-generation college graduate. Desperate to break into the tech industry. According to Valerie's research, He accepted an unpaid internship at Derek's logistics startup, hoping it would eventually become a real salaried position. Instead, he became collateral damage in a federal crime. Rain slicked the pavement as I pulled into the crowded coffee shop parking lot. Neon light reflected across wet asphalt in distorted streaks of red and blue. Valerie stood beside her black sedan waiting for me, dressed in a tailored gray suit that looked more like armor than fabric. We skipped greetings entirely. Side by side, we walked toward the glass entrance doors in perfect sync. Inside, the coffee shop buzzed with ordinary life. Students studied beneath hanging lights. Friends talked quietly over drinks. Espresso machines hissed in the background while the smell of roasted coffee and stale pastries filled the warm air. An utterly normal setting for a legal ambush. Valerie scanned the room once before nodding toward the back corner. Jason sat alone at a small circular table hunched over a glowing laptop. He looked even younger in person. Faded hoodie, wire-rimmed glasses constantly sliding down his nose. Empty coffee cups and crumpled napkins scattered around him like evidence of sleepless nights. He looked exactly like what he was. An exhausted intern trying desperately to earn approval from a boss who was secretly drowning in debt. We approached from behind his blind spot. Valerie pulled out the chair across from him and sat down immediately. I took the seat beside him, trapping him against the wall of the booth. Jason flinched so hard his hand clipped a paper cup, splashing cold coffee onto the table. His eyes darted between us nervously. He started apologizing automatically, assuming we wanted the seats. I looked directly into his eyes. "My name is C. Garcia," I said calmly, "and I believe you recently notarized a document for my husband." Every ounce of color drained from his face. His skin turned pale gray. The typing stopped instantly. His trembling hands hovered above the keyboard. He knew my name, and he knew exactly which document I meant. Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. His gaze flicked around the crowded cafe, searching desperately for an exit. Finally, he swallowed hard, adjusted his glasses, and attempted to sound professional. He claimed he processed dozens of administrative documents for the company and could not remember any specific paperwork. The lie collapsed the moment it left his mouth. Valerie did not give him time to recover. She reached into her blazer, removed a leather credential wallet, and slid it across the sticky wooden table. The gold insignia of a senior corporate compliance auditor reflected under the overhead lights. Valerie leaned forward slowly, elbows resting on the table. Her voice stayed calm, clinical, sharp enough to cut glass. She explained that memory problems were common under stress, and that she was here to help refresh his recollection before federal investigators became involved. Then she recited the exact date tied to the fraudulent document, the timestamp, the serial number attached to the notary seal. Without raising her voice even once, she outlined the legal consequences of real estate wire fraud under Delaware law. She described mandatory sentencing guidelines for a licensed notary involved in the theft of $650,000. Step by step, she painted the future waiting for him. Career destroyed before it even began. Permanent felony record. No second chances. Jason physically shrank in his chair. He pulled his hands away from the keyboard and hid them beneath the table. His breathing became quick and shallow while the sounds of the coffee shop seemed to disappear around us. Then he made one final attempt to save himself. He looked directly at me with desperate eyes and insisted he followed procedure. Claimed he checked my identification before notarizing the document. Claimed he would never risk his license. I leaned closer until my shoulder nearly touched his. My voice remained completely level. I told him that on October 3rd, the day he supposedly witnessed my signature, I was attending a quarterly logistics conference with more than 80 employees present. I explained that I possessed building access logs, security footage, and meeting records proving exactly where I was that afternoon. Then I told him the signature on the document looked like it had been drawn by a child using the wrong hand. Silence settled heavily across the table. I let it crush him. Then I delivered the final blow. I told him Derek was locked out of the title company portal and the money had been frozen. The fraud had failed. The only remaining question was who would carry the consequences. That broke him. Jason dropped his face into his hands. His shoulders shook violently. A strangled sob escaped his throat. The ambitious young intern disappeared completely, leaving behind a terrified kid realizing he had destroyed his future for a man who never even paid him. When he finally looked up, tears streaked across his glasses, and the truth poured out all at once. He said Derek called him into the office late on a Friday after everyone else had gone home. Derek locked the door behind him. Then he placed the power of attorney paperwork on the desk and ordered Jason to notarize the signature line. Jason said he refused at first. He explained it was illegal to notarize documents without the signer physically present. That was when Derek used fear. He told Jason the startup was about to secure major venture capital funding, promised him a high-paying salaried position with stock options if he proved his loyalty. But if he refused, Derek threatened to terminate the internship immediately. And not just that. Derek promised he would personally contact every major tech and logistics company in the tri-state area and make sure Jason was blacklisted from the industry before his career even began. He swore to shatter the young man's academic record and dismantle his prospects over a single blue stamp. Jason, eyes glistening, swiped at them with his sweatshirt sleeve. He met my gaze, raw vulnerability laid bare. He spoke of being buried under student loan debt, of his simple desire for employment. He confessed that his fear of Derek had driven him to stamp the document unread, overlooking the signature. A fleeting pang of pity for the boy surfaced. Derek had exploited his desperation, manipulating him with the same practiced ease he'd used to undermine my financial security. Yet, pity wouldn't safeguard my home. I needed his confession solidified in truth. Valerie retrieved a yellow legal pad and a black pen from her leather tote. She placed them on the table, directly before Jason. "Write down everything you just told us," she instructed, demanding precise details: the date, time, location, and the explicit threats Derek employed to ensure his compliance. She impressed upon him that this written account was his sole defense against the impending civil and criminal lawsuits. "Cooperation is your only path to immunity," she stated. Jason didn't hesitate. With trembling fingers, he grasped the pen and began to write. Ink bled across the yellow paper, meticulously detailing my husband's transgression. He filled 2 pages, enumerating the coercion, the hollow promises, and the exact moment the fraudulent seal was applied. He signed and dated the second page. Valerie smoothly slid the legal pad across the table, claiming the document. She scrutinized the confession, her eyes methodically sweeping across the paragraphs. A single nod confirmed the statement's legal sufficiency. She folded the yellow pages and tucked them into her blazer pocket. We held the key. The fraudulent notary seal was officially neutralized. The power of attorney had transformed into concrete criminal evidence. We rose from the table. I looked down at Jason, who sat staring at the bare wooden surface, appearing drained and hollowed out. "Go home and block Derek's number," I advised. "Start looking for a new career. This startup won't exist by Monday." Valerie and I exited the coffee shop, leaving the petrified intern behind. The cool night air was a welcome, sharp clarity in my lungs. We stood by our cars in the parking lot, streetlights casting elongated shadows. Valerie touched my arm. "The trap is fully sprung," she declared. "You have all the ammunition needed to dismantle his narrative." I nodded, the weight of Jason's signed confession palpable in Valerie's pocket. The forensic trail was complete. The audio recording of his parents was secured. The intern had folded. Derek was isolated, utterly unaware. My phone vibrated. It was a message from Derek. He was leaving the rented chateau and heading home to Wilmington, complaining about a software glitch, but claiming exhaustion before the investor launch party. He ended with a heart emoji. A cold smile touched my lips. He was coming home to sleep under my roof, content in his illusion of control. I need to get home before him, I told Valerie. The physical evidence was ours, but the legal kill shot remained. I had to file the paperwork with the county clerk to prevent the title company from finalizing the transaction. I entered my car and started the engine. The drive to Wilmington was 20 minutes. Derek was handing me the perfect opportunity. He would sleep dreaming of his imminent wealth, while I logged into the county portal and permanently froze the ground beneath his ambitions. The midnight strike was imminent. I arrived back at the Wilmington house just before 11 p.m. The neighborhood was hushed, streetlights etching long shadows across manicured lawns. My practical sedan settled into the driveway. The front door clicked shut behind me, keys jingling softly. The house felt changed tonight, a crime scene masquerading as a sanctuary. In the kitchen, I poured a glass of cold water. My hands were finally steady. The adrenaline from confronting Jason Miller had receded, replaced by a deep, chilling calm. I had the confession, the written proof of coercion, signed by a terrified intern, rested safely in Valerie's tote. The audio recording of Susan and Richard admitting their complicity was securely uploaded to my cloud storage. I possessed the evidence to dismantle Derek's narrative, but evidence alone doesn't halt a real estate transaction. It must be weaponized. Just after midnight, the rattle of the garage door announced Derek's arrival. His heavy footsteps crossed the threshold. He tossed his keys onto the entry table with unnecessary force. I watched from the hallway's shadows as he walked toward the kitchen, his shoulders slumped, his expensive suit jacket hanging loosely. The confident tech bro from hours earlier was gone, replaced by a man buckling under his own deceit. I stepped into the light. He startled, jumping at my sudden appearance. My expression remained neutral, a small, supportive smile on my face. "How is the rest of your evening?" I inquired. He ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its styled perfection. He grumbled about software developers and banking regulations, spinning a tale of a bureaucratic delay involving a biometric lock requiring a manual override. He assured me he'd sort it first thing Monday. Leaning against the kitchen island, rubbing his eyes, he declared he was too tired to deal with it and desperately needed rest before the investor launch party. He needed to be sharp, project success. I poured him a glass of water. "You work too hard," I told him. "You deserve a good night's sleep." The hypocrisy tasted like copper, but I swallowed it down, kneading him comfortable, oblivious. We walked upstairs. The simple domestic routine felt surreal. Brushing our teeth side by side in the master bathroom, we met our reflections in the mirror. I watched him scrutinize his face, checking for wrinkles, adjusting his jawline. He was utterly consumed by his public image, unaware the foundation of that image was crumbling. He climbed into bed, pulling the duvet over his chest, turning his back to me, exhausted from the mental gymnastics of maintaining his fraudulent reality. Within 5 minutes, his breathing deepened into a steady rhythm. He was fast asleep. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling. The digital clock cast a faint red glow across the sheets. The intimacy was suffocating. I listened to the steady breathing of a man who had promised a life with me while actively trying to steal my future. For 6 years, I had been his safety net, managing the household, providing the stability for his illusions. He rewarded my loyalty by forging my name, bleeding my equity, and conspiring with his parents to strip me of everything. The betrayal was visceral, a physical weight pressing against my chest, but it didn't crush me. It solidified my resolve. For another 30 minutes, I listened to the steady cadence of his snores. Slowly, with deliberate precision, I eased myself out from under the covers. I retrieved my laptop from the chair by the window and moved silently down the hall to the guest bedroom. Closing the door softly, I switched on the small desk lamp. The screen illuminated the darkened room, casting a pale blue light across my face. It was 1:45 a.m. Opening my email client, I found a message from Martin Hayes, my attorney. Martin, a sharp and pragmatic real estate lawyer, had been consulted earlier that afternoon while Derek was otherwise occupied renting the chateau. He had drafted the necessary legal documents but required the final piece of evidence before authorization. I typed a brief reply, confirming receipt of the confession, and attached a high-resolution scan of the yellow legal pad pages Jason Miller had filled. I sent the email and waited. Martin replied within 3 minutes. He understood the urgency of a closing window. He provided a secure link to the Delaware County Clerk's electronic portal. Clicking the link, the dark blue interface of the government website loaded. This was not a consumer-facing application. It was the unvarnished architecture of the legal system, held up solely by the failed biometric scan. I clicked the button labeled File Dispute. A formal digital form appeared, and with cold, mechanical efficiency, I filled out the required fields: my legal name, contact information, and the property's parcel number. I proceeded to the upload section, attaching the drafted affidavit of forgery, a sworn legal statement declaring, under penalty of perjury, that I had never signed the power of attorney on file. I also attached Jason Miller's scanned confession, detailing the coercion and the fraudulent application of the notary seal. Reviewing the attachments, I ensured every file was perfectly legible. Scrolling to the bottom of the page, I encountered a small checkbox requiring verification of the submitted information. I clicked it. A green checkmark appeared. Hovering my cursor over the final Submit button, I knew this was the point of no return. Clicking it would trigger an immediate automatic alert within the county system. The title company would receive formal notification of a criminal dispute, and a hard, unremovable legal freeze would be placed on the deed. The sale would be officially and permanently dead. Derek could call every customer service representative in the country, and it wouldn't matter. The transaction could not proceed without a judge's order. I pressed the mousepad. The screen refreshed, displaying a stark confirmation page. A digital receipt with a formal tracking number appeared. The freeze was active. The ground beneath Derek's feet was now legally locked. I exhaled a long, slow breath, the tension that had been building in my shoulders since the banker's call finally releasing. The financial execution was halted. My house was secure. Closing the laptop, I left the guest bedroom dark and walked back down the hallway to the master suite. Derek was still asleep, snoring softly, utterly unaware that his digital empire had just been legally vaporized. Climbing back into bed, I pulled the covers up. Listening to his breathing, the sound was no longer suffocating. It sounded pathetic. He was a man sleeping peacefully on a live grenade. The sun rose, casting a gray morning light across the bedroom. Derek woke up humming a generic pop song. The panic from the previous night seemed to have vanished, replaced by the manic energy of a man preparing for his final performance. Today was the massive investor launch party at the rented chateau. He believed he was hours away from securing venture capital and clearing the final hurdle of the title company glitch. He emerged from the master bathroom, dressed in a crisp white dress shirt and expensive tailored trousers. He stood before the full-length mirror, holding a dark silk tie, studying his reflection with intense focus. He adjusted his collar, projecting the image of a successful tech visionary. Catching my eye in the mirror, he smiled. "Are you ready for the big day?" he asked. "This party is going to change our lives. Everything is finally falling into place." I rose from the edge of the bed and walked over to him. Taking the dark silk tie from his hands, I draped it around his neck, my fingers brushing against the crisp cotton of his collar. With practiced ease, I executed the complex knot, pulling the silk tight against his throat. Smoothing the fabric, I patted his chest. Looking directly into his eyes, I returned his arrogant smile with a perfectly constructed mask of supportive admiration. You look incredible. You're going to command the room. Everyone is going to see exactly who you really are. He kissed my forehead, completely blind to the double meaning of my words. Thanking me, he grabbed his expensive leather briefcase and hurried out the door, eager to prepare the chateau for his guests. I stood alone in the bedroom as silence returned to the house. The midnight strike had been executed flawlessly. The house was safe. The evidence was gathered. Now it was time to prepare for the public execution. I walked to my closet to select the armor I would wear to watch his empire burn. The morning sun cast harsh, bright beams across the kitchen counter where Derek had stood just hours before. The house was finally quiet. He had taken his briefcase, his fake confidence, and his least luxurious car to the rented chateau, leaving me alone to finalize the logistics of his downfall. I poured the remaining coffee down the sink, watching the dark liquid swirl into the drain. My timeline was tight. The party started at 2 p.m. I had 5 hours to build the arsenal. I drove to a commercial printing center in downtown Wilmington, an industrial space tucked between a shipping warehouse and a corporate law firm. Valerie was waiting for me by the entrance, holding a flash drive containing the sum total of my husband's digital crimes. We exchanged no greetings, walking straight to the high-volume production desk. The clerk, a young woman chewing blue gum, received the flash drive, and I gave her specific instructions. We needed 50 copies of 3 distinct files. The first file was the formal affidavit of forgery, bearing the official timestamp from the Delaware County Clerk indicating the legal freeze on my property. The second was Jason Miller's written confession, outlining the coercion and the fraudulent notary seal in his own frantic handwriting. The third was the compiled ledger of Derek's cryptocurrency margin calls, highlighting the devastating financial crater he had attempted to bury. I requested the documents be printed on heavy stock paper. I wanted the evidence to feel substantial in the hands of his investors, the reality of his fraud to carry physical weight. The industrial printers whirred to life, the sharp chemical smell of hot toner filling the air. Valerie and I stood side by side, watching the machines churn out pages. Each sheet represented a lie stripped of its power. We gathered the warm stacks and moved to a long wooden assembly table in the back corner of the shop. Valerie opened a cardboard box she'd brought from her corporate office, containing 50 sleek matte black presentation folders, the kind used for elite board meetings or high-stakes mergers. We worked in silent synchronization. I collated the pages, sliding the affidavit, confession, and bank statements into the right side pocket. Valerie secured a glossy business card detailing Derek's new logistics startup into the front slot of each folder, creating a stark visual contrast between his projected illusion and his documented reality. We packed the completed dossiers into 2 canvas bags, the weight pulled at my shoulders. Leaving the print shop, we loaded the bags into the trunk of my practical sedan. Valerie told me she would meet me at the chateau, arriving separately to avoid drawing attention to our coordinated appearance. I drove back to my secure home to prepare. Entering the master bedroom, I opened my closet doors. The left side held Derek's expensive designer suits, silk ties, and imported Italian leather shoes. The right side was my wardrobe. For 6 years, I had dressed the part of the background character, opting for soft pastel dresses or unassuming cardigans at his networking events, allowing him to command the spotlight while I faded into the wallpaper. He preferred me approachable and manageable. Pushing the cocktail dresses aside, I reached toward the back of the rack and pulled out a tailored navy suit. I had purchased it 3 years ago for a major corporate logistics presentation but rarely wore it. As Derek claimed, the sharp lines made me look too severe. Today, severity was the objective. I put on the crisp white blouse and buttoned the dark jacket. The fabric of the suit felt like armor. I fastened a simple silver watch around my wrist, checking the time. 1:30 p.m. Looking at my reflection in the full-length mirror, the woman staring back did not resemble a supportive spouse here to celebrate her husband's genius. She looked like an executioner arriving to deliver a verdict. Grabbing my car keys, I walked out the door, locking the deadbolt behind me. The drive to Greenville felt shorter than it had the previous day. Winding roads led me back to the sprawling faux chateau. The circular driveway was already packed with vehicles, sleek silver sports cars, imported luxury sedans, and massive black SUVs lined the stone pavers. It resembled a summit of wealth and influence. Derek had managed to gather the top tier of the Wilmington venture capital scene, promising disruptive technology and the illusion of immense personal liquidity. I parked down the street and retrieved the heavy canvas bag from my trunk. The cool autumn air chilled my face as I walked up the long driveway. The heavy oak front doors stood wide open. A string quartet played a lively classical piece in the grand foyer. Waiters carrying silver trays of champagne wove through the growing crowd of well-dressed guests. I stepped over the threshold, the heavy canvas strap digging into my shoulder. The noise of the party washed over me. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of networking filling the cavernous space. My eyes scanned the room, searching for the architects of my betrayal. I spotted Susan and Richard immediately. They were standing near the grand staircase holding crystal flutes, holding court with a group of older, affluent investors. Susan wore a designer silk dress, her posture radiating an unearned aristocratic superiority. She was laughing, tossing her head back, bragging about her son's brilliant entrepreneurial pivot. Richard nodded along, projecting the image of a proud patriarch. They were soaking up the prestige, intoxicating themselves on a fraudulent reality built entirely on the stolen equity of my home. They did not notice me standing in the entryway. I moved through the crowd, tracking my husband. Derek was by the back patio doors, surrounded by a circle of young tech founders and potential financial backers. He was in his element, gesturing animatedly, explaining his logistics application with the same buzzwords he had practiced in my kitchen. He looked vibrant, confident, and untouchable. Valerie appeared beside me, holding her own canvas bag. Dressed in a dark blazer, she blended seamlessly into the corporate crowd. She leaned close to my ear, her voice barely audible over the string quartet. She gestured towards the VIP seating area in the formal sunken living room just off the main foyer. The room featured several low-glass tables surrounded by plush leather sofas, with reserved placards designating the space for lead investors and primary financial targets. This was the staging ground, where Derek planned to secure his seed capital. After Derek delivered his formal pitch, we moved with precise, calculated purpose. Derek was too busy playing the charismatic host to monitor his own wife. Susan and Richard were too busy inflating their egos to watch the perimeter. Valerie and I slipped into the sunken living room. The area was temporarily empty as guests mingled near the bars. We opened the canvas bags. I took out a stack of the matte black presentation folders. Their sleek, dark covers felt smooth under my fingertips. I knelt beside the first glass table and slid 3 folders onto the lower shelf, just out of plain sight, but easily accessible. Valerie mirrored my actions at the second table, sliding the dossiers beneath the leather seating cushions and onto decorative side stands. We moved through the designated VIP section, planting the explosive evidence with the quiet efficiency of logistics professionals managing a warehouse floor. We distributed all 50 folders across the room, ensuring every significant investor would have a copy within arm's reach. The physical trap was set. The legal documents, the handwritten confession, and the bank records were waiting in the shadows. We folded the empty canvas bags and tucked them behind a large potted palm tree in the corner. Valerie gave me a single nod and melted back into the crowd, making her way toward the catering station to maintain her cover. I stood alone at the edge of the sunken living room, smoothing the lapels of my navy suit. The string quartet transitioned to a faster tempo. The noise of the crowd swelled. The countdown had reached 0. The arsenal was deployed. I turned my attention back to the grand foyer, preparing to wait for Derek to begin his scheduled speech. But as I scanned the sea of faces, my eyes locked onto a man standing near the marble fireplace. He was an older gentleman wearing a bespoke gray suit, holding a glass of sparkling water. It was Arthur Sterling. He was the prominent local venture capitalist Derek had been desperately courting. More importantly, Arthur Sterling was the man whose name was listed as the buyer on the fraudulent deed sitting in the county clerk's electronic portal. He was the man whose escrow funds were currently frozen. Derek had invited the very man he was actively defrauding to the launch party, treating him as a guest of honor to secure even more funding. The sheer audacity of the move sent a thrill of cold anticipation down my spine. The target was in the room. The folders were in place. The execution required a spark. I took a slow breath, stepping away from the sunken living room, and walked straight toward Mr. Sterling. The final phase was about to begin. Arthur Sterling was not a man who blended into the background. He stood near the marble fireplace, radiating the quiet, authoritative energy of a man who controlled millions in venture capital. He was around 60 years old with silver hair swept back from a sharp, angular face. His bespoke gray suit hung perfectly on his lean frame. While other guests mingled and shouted over the string quartet, Mr. Sterling simply observed, holding his glass of sparkling water. He was a shark swimming through a school of guppies, testing the waters before deciding to bite. He was the primary target. He was the man Derek had been desperately courting for months, promising disruptive logistics technology and unprecedented returns. More importantly, Arthur Sterling was the buyer listed on the fraudulent deed sitting in the county clerk's electronic portal. He was the man who had authorized a $650,000 escrow transfer to purchase my home at a steep discount, unaware the entire transaction was a federal crime. Derek had invited the very man he was actively defrauding to the launch party, treating him as a guest of honor to secure even more funding. It was a staggering display of arrogance. Derek believed he could juggle the stolen house, the frozen title company funds, and the startup capital without ever dropping a ball. I adjusted the cuffs of my navy suit, taking a slow, deliberate breath. The air in the grand foyer felt thick with perfume and expensive cologne. The noise of the crowd swelled. I needed to separate Mr. Sterling from the herd before Derek realized I was speaking to him. I needed to strike a localized, precise blow. I walked toward the fireplace, my heels clicking softly against the polished floorboards. I did not rush. I projected the calm, steady demeanor of a woman who belonged in the room. Mr. Sterling noticed my approach. His eyes flicked toward me, assessing, evaluating. He recognized me from a brief introduction Derek had made at a previous networking event. He offered a polite, reserved smile, preparing for the standard pleasantries expected from a supportive spouse. I stopped a few feet from him, maintaining a respectful distance. I did not offer a handshake. I did not engage in small talk. I looked directly into his sharp gray eyes and lowered my voice, ensuring the surrounding guests could not overhear our conversation. "Mr. Sterling," I began, "I'm Kat Garcia, Derek's wife. I need 2 minutes of your time regarding the pending real estate transaction for the property in Wilmington." The polite smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of guarded curiosity. He took a sip of his sparkling water. "The closing is scheduled for Monday morning," he stated, "but I understand there's a minor administrative delay with the title company software." Derek assured me it would be resolved promptly. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my smartphone, keeping my movements fluid and unhurried. I unlocked my phone and opened the PDF I had downloaded earlier that morning. Then I looked directly at Mr. Sterling. I told him there was no software malfunction. The transaction had been frozen because the power of attorney used to authorize the sale was fraudulent. I held the phone toward him, the bright screen illuminating the formal affidavit declaring the forgery. The timestamp from the Delaware County Clerk's office glowed in red beneath the official seals, confirming the legal freeze placed on the property. Mr. Sterling did not react immediately. He was an experienced investor, a man accustomed to volatility, pressure, and sudden financial disasters. His expression remained controlled as his eyes moved carefully across the document. He read every line, the legal language, the official seals, the criminal filing. Then the color slowly drained from his face. The realization struck with visible force. His $650,000 escrow transfer was not sitting safely in a protected account. It was trapped inside a felony wire fraud scheme orchestrated by the man currently across the room, pretending to sell him a revolutionary logistics startup. He had been conned, played by a desperate amateur wearing an expensive suit. Mr. Sterling lowered his drink slowly. His knuckles whitened around the glass. He did not raise his voice, did not create a scene. Instead, his tone dropped into a gravelly whisper sharp enough to cut steel. He asked whether I understood the seriousness of the document I was showing him. Then he asked if I realized my husband had attempted to defraud him out of more than $500,000. I slid the phone back into my pocket and met his stare without hesitation. I told him I understood exactly what Derek had done. I explained that my husband was bankrupt, drowning under catastrophic cryptocurrency margin calls, and had stolen my property equity in a desperate attempt to stay solvent. Then I clarified one critical fact. I was the sole legal owner of the property, and both civil and criminal proceedings were already underway. Mr. Sterling absorbed the information silently, jaw tightening harder with every second. Then he looked across the crowded room. His gaze locked onto Derek. My husband stood near the patio doors, laughing loudly beside a group of young founders, champagne glass in hand, completely unaware that his empire was detonating behind him. Mr. Sterling shifted his weight. Then he said he would contact his legal team immediately. By Monday morning, he planned to file injunctions against Derek Garcia and the logistics company itself. He promised to bury my husband beneath litigation until nothing remained. I stepped closer before he could walk away. I needed to redirect his anger. A private lawsuit would destroy Derek financially, yes, but it would also allow him to rewrite the story. It would give him space to claim confusion, misunderstandings, accounting errors, technical disputes. Derek survived through illusion. If the collapse happened quietly behind closed doors, he would simply move on and find another victim. Mr. Sterling narrowed his eyes at me, studying me differently now, not as a victim, as a strategist. Then he asked what I was proposing. I kept my voice low and steady. I explained that Derek was scheduled to address the entire room in less than 20 minutes. Tonight's presentation was designed to establish legitimacy. Derek intended to use Mr. Sterling's attendance and the pending property deal as proof of his financial genius. I offered him an alliance. Temporary, calculated. I asked him to wait. To let Derek climb the staircase. To let him build the lie as high as possible in front of every investor, socialite, and entrepreneur in attendance. And then I promised to hand him the match. I told Mr. Sterling about the matte black presentation folders Valerie and I had already hidden throughout the sunken living room. Inside those folders sat the evidence, the notarized confession, the crypto ledgers, the forged documents, the proof. I promised him that if he waited until the climax of the speech, he could withdraw his support publicly. He could expose Derek in front of every influential person in the tri-state venture capital circle. Mr. Sterling listened carefully. The fury in his eyes slowly transformed into something colder, more deliberate. He hated being deceived, but he also appreciated precision. A quiet lawsuit was routine business. A public destruction at a launch event was unforgettable. He glanced toward Derek once more before looking back at me. Then he gave a single sharp nod. Agreement. He promised to hold his position until the speech concluded. But he warned me that if I lost control of the situation, his attorneys would move without hesitation. I assured him I had no intention of losing control. Then I thanked him and stepped away from the fireplace, disappearing back into the crowd. The alliance was complete. The lead investor had officially become an active participant in the destruction of the startup. I moved toward the catering station near the sunken living room searching for Valerie. The string quartet had just finished a piece and shifted into a softer ambient melody. Around the foyer, the energy of the evening subtly changed. Caterers stopped circulating hors d'oeuvres. The event was transitioning. Derek stepped away from the patio doors with adrenaline written all over his face. Champagne flute in hand, he moved toward the massive staircase dominating the center of the foyer. Then he signaled for the music to stop. Conversations faded one by one until the room fell silent. He climbed several marble steps, positioning himself physically above the crowd, above the investors, above his parents, above the socialites orbiting his manufactured success. Like a king addressing his court. He tapped a silver spoon against his champagne glass. The sharp ringing echoed through the room. 100 guests turned toward him. Arthur Sterling stood near the fireplace with a face carved from stone. Valerie waited near the sunken living room ready to distribute the folders. Susan and Richard stood near the front, glowing with pride they had never earned. And I stood in the center of the room wearing my navy suit like armor. Watching my husband prepare to deliver a speech built entirely on theft and lies. The countdown had ended. The microphone moment had arrived. The sharp crack of silver against crystal sliced through the silence of the rented chateau. Derek stood on the third stair holding a wireless microphone in one hand and a half-full champagne flute in the other. Elevated above the crowd, he surveyed the room filled with venture capitalists, startup founders, and Wilmington elites. He tapped the glass once more. The quartet lowered their instruments. The remaining chatter disappeared. Every eye focused on him. I stood near the base of the staircase, posture rigid, expression unreadable. Watching the man I married 6 years earlier prepare to sell fantasy as truth. Derek smiled. That familiar boyish grin. The same smile he used to escape missed deadlines, failed ventures, and broken promises. Tonight, he intended to use it to secure millions in funding. He welcomed the crowd warmly and thanked everyone for attending the celebration of what he called a new era in logistics technology. His voice flowed smoothly through the expensive sound system. Practiced, polished, dangerously convincing. As he paced across the marble staircase, he projected the confidence of a founder already certain of victory. Industry jargon poured from him effortlessly. Market disruption, scalable infrastructure, agile capital routing. He claimed his company was positioned to dominate East Coast supply chains within a single fiscal quarter. While he spoke, I studied the audience. The younger startup founders nodded enthusiastically, captivated by his performance. To them, Derek looked like success incarnate. The older investors remained more restrained, waiting for actual numbers beneath the polished buzzwords. At the front stood Susan and Richard, radiating smug pride. Susan clutched her designer handbag with her chin tilted upward, basking in reflected status. Her silk dress had been purchased with money she believed came from her son's brilliance instead of my stolen equity. Richard held his scotch glass like a trophy. Together they looked like royalty attending a coronation, completely intoxicated by prestige, completely blind to the trap closing around them. Then Derek shifted the tone of his speech. His voice softened, became more intimate. He told the crowd that building a disruptive technology empire required more than vision and ambition. It required sacrifice, risk, personal investment. He spoke about liquidating valuable real estate assets to finance his dream, presenting himself as a fearless entrepreneur willing to gamble everything for success. I surveyed the room, my gaze finding Arthur Sterling by the marble fireplace. The seasoned venture capitalist remained motionless, his shrewd gray eyes fixed on Derek. Sterling was privy to the truth behind the liquidated real estate. He understood his escrow transfer was entangled in a felony fraud scheme. A silent accord passed between us across the expanse of unsuspecting guests. Sterling clutched his sparkling water, awaiting my fulfillment of a promise. Derek's attention shifted to me. The spotlight of his gaze compelled the crowd to follow. He raised his champagne flute in my direction, a show of manufactured idolatry. He informed the audience that none of this would be possible without his anchor, calling me his muse. He claimed my steadfast backing had liberated him to restructure their assets and establish this foundation. The insincerity tasted of rust in my mouth. He was publicly lauding me for enabling him to forge my signature, coerce an intern, and abscond with my $650,000 home. The sheer audacity of his falsehood was staggering. He extended his free hand, beckoning me to join him on the steps for the audience's celebratory applause. A warm ovation ensued. They perceived a devoted partner stepping forward to share a triumphant moment. I felt the smooth weave of my navy suit adjust as I took the first step, my heels tapping on the polished marble. I advanced with the measured, deliberate cadence of a woman enacting a final decree. Reaching the third step, I stood beside him. He exuded expensive cologne and a faint, sharp scent of adrenaline. He placed his arm around my waist, drawing me near for the assembly. His grip was firm, possessive, a physical intimation to play my role and smile for the investors. He leaned towards the microphone, preparing to deliver his concluding remarks. His intention was to conclude his toast and usher the elite financial backers into the sunken living room to discuss their capital commitments. I preempted his speech. Reaching out, I enclosed my fingers around the sleek black handle of the microphone. I did not snatch it from his grasp, but applied a steady, unyielding pressure. Derek glanced at me, his smile faltering for a fleeting instant. Confusion flickered in his eyes. He assumed I wished to offer a few words of thanks, a brief platitude regarding my pride in his diligence. He relinquished his grip, allowing me to take the device. The microphone felt substantial, cold, and potent in my hand. I moved away from his embrace, severing our physical connection. I turned to face the 100 guests. The room fell silent, awaiting my heartfelt contribution to the launch party. I met Susan's eyes in the front row. Her proud smile remained fixed, anticipating my validation of her son's brilliance. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice resonated through the vaulted ceiling, precise, clear, and devoid of any discernible emotion. I acknowledged that Derek had spoken the truth regarding his audacious asset management. I paused, allowing the statement to settle. I observed a few investors nod in affirmation. Then, I delivered the decisive blow, shattering his constructed reality with a single declaration. I stated that the real estate he had liquidated to finance this event and his startup was registered solely in my name. I declared that he had forged my signature on a power of attorney to facilitate its sale. The ensuing silence was not one of anticipation, but the breathless void of a room deprived of its oxygen. The polite smiles evaporated from the guests' faces, replaced by expressions of pure bewilderment. Susan gasped, her hand flying to her throat, her designer handbag slipping from her grasp and thudding onto the floor. Richard stumbled backward, sloshing his scotch onto his expensive leather footwear. The collective shock surged through the assembly, paralyzing the space. Derek reacted with the frantic desperation of a cornered animal. His face flushed a dark, furious red. He emitted a strained, unnatural chuckle, attempting to bridge the chasm between his fabricated success and the truth I had just unveiled. He moved towards me, his hand extending to reclaim the microphone. He leaned close to my face, his voice a harsh, frantic whisper intended solely for me. He commanded me to cease speaking. He hissed that I had imbibed too much wine and was jeopardizing the most significant day of his life. He attempted to project the image of a husband managing an erratic spouse, hoping the audience would dismiss my statement as a drunken aberration. I had anticipated his maneuver. I pivoted on my heel, stepping back and ascending to the fourth stair, positioning myself beyond his immediate reach. I held the microphone firmly, maintaining my elevated vantage point. Derek stood below me, his hand grasping empty air. The suave tech visionary had vanished, leaving a perspiring, panicked fraud exposed before the city's most influential figures. I did not engage with his whisper. I did not defend my sobriety. I looked past his head, addressing the stunned, silent throng. I shifted my gaze towards the sunken living room where the reserved glass tables awaited the elite financial backers. I spoke into the microphone one last time. My voice cut through the tension, clear and authoritative. I suggested that the VIPs consult the black folders situated beneath their tables. The silence in the grand foyer was palpable. It pressed against the walls, muffling the lingering strains of the string quartet and the clinking of crystal. 100 guests stood frozen, processing the words I had just uttered into the microphone. I remained on the fourth stair of the sweeping staircase, looking down at the multitude of faces. I did not break eye contact with the crowd. I did not look at the man standing below me. The instruction had been issued, and the execution was now beyond my purview. In the sunken living room, the designated elite financial backers exchanged bewildered glances. They observed the reserved glass tables. They noted the matte black presentation folders resting quietly beneath the leather cushions and on the decorative side stands, precisely as I had instructed. Valerie emerged from the shadows near the catering station. She moved with the quiet efficiency of a corporate auditor conducting a hostile takeover. She remained silent. She simply walked to the nearest glass table, gathered a stack of the dark folders, and began distributing them directly to the bewildered venture capitalists. She presented the evidence with professional detachment, offering the dossier as a waiter might serve the main course at a formal dinner. The heavy cardstock covers opened. The crisp white pages within caught the light from the overhead chandelier. Derek turned his head, following Valerie's movements. His mind struggled to comprehend the abrupt alteration in circumstances. He looked at the black folders and then back up at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying clarity. The arrogant tech visionary facade crumbled. He realized I had not merely made a drunken accusation. I had provided documentation. His champagne flute slipped from his fingers. The crystal struck the edge of the marble stair and shattered, scattering a spray of expensive liquor and sharp fragments across the polished floor. He scrambled down the remaining steps, his expensive leather shoes momentarily slipping on the spilled champagne. He pushed past a wealthy socialite, almost knocking her over in his desperate haste to reach the sunken living room. He shouted for everyone to cease observing the documents. He claimed the folders contained stolen proprietary data and fabricated falsehoods. He lunged towards a young tech founder who was already perusing the initial page. Derek reached out his fingers, clawing at the black cover. He attempted to snatch the dossier away, but the younger man stepped back, retracting the evidence from his reach. The young founder regarded Derek with a mixture of pity and revulsion. The physical altercation shattered the room's spell. The polished, sophisticated launch party devolved into a chaotic scramble for the truth. More investors opened their folders. The rustling of paper filled the silence. Eyes scanned the formal affidavit of forgery bearing the official red timestamp from the Delaware County clerk. They read the frantic handwritten confession of Jason Miller, detailing the coercion and the fraudulent notary seal. They turned to the final pages. their attention fixed on the irrefutable ledgers displaying hundreds of thousands of dollars in catastrophic cryptocurrency margin calls. The facade of the successful entrepreneur crumbled, replaced by the undeniable evidence of a desperate criminal. Near the marble fireplace, Arthur Sterling remained utterly still. He didn't scramble for a folder. He already held the one Valerie had placed by his seat earlier. The black dossier lay open in his left hand, his right resting casually in his trouser pocket. He read the contents with the swift comprehension of a man who had spent decades dissecting risk and identifying flawed investments. Sterling closed the folder. The sharp snap of the heavy cardstock reverberated through the room. He moved, departing from the fireplace's perimeter. The crowd parted for him, instinctively sensing the shift in authority. He strode into the center of the sunken living room, his bespoke gray suit commanding immediate deference. He halted 3 feet from my husband. Derek froze, his chest heaving with ragged, shallow breaths. He wiped a hand across his forehead, smearing a sheen of cold sweat. He eyed the veteran venture capitalist, seeking a lifeline. He opened his mouth to weave another falsehood to explain away the federal fraud documented in black and white. Sterling cut him off. He regarded Derek with pure, unadulterated contempt. The older man's voice did not rise. He had no need to shout to be heard. His tone was icy, measured, and sharp enough to draw blood. He asked Derek if he genuinely believed he could sell a stolen house to finance a failing startup. The words lingered, a brutal encapsulation of the entire elaborate charade. The remaining guests murmured amongst themselves, the realization dawning across the room. The party's host was not a burgeoning star in the logistics industry, but a fraudster attempting to dupe the most powerful investor in Wilmington. Derek stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched sound of pure panic. He raised his hands, palms outward in a gesture of surrender. He attempted to address Mr. Sterling by his first name, trying to leverage a familiarity that had long since evaporated. He claimed a misunderstanding regarding a bridge loan. He asserted the paperwork was merely a temporary placeholder until the actual seed capital cleared. It was a pathetic display. The slick, charismatic host who had charmed his way through countless networking events was gone. In his place stood a sweating, stammering amateur whose tailored suit now appeared 2 sizes too large. Sterling shook his head, a brief, dismissive gesture. He addressed the room directly, his voice elevated so everyone in the grand foyer could hear the verdict. He announced his formal withdrawal of all pending financial commitments to the logistics startup, effective immediately. He declared that not a single cent of his venture capital would ever reach an account associated with Derek Garcia. Sterling turned his cold gaze back to my husband. He promised the financial withdrawal was merely the prelude. He instructed Derek to anticipate a call from his legal team first thing Monday morning. He proclaimed his intention to file a civil lawsuit for fraud, misrepresentation, and attempted grand larceny. He vowed to tie up every remaining asset Derek possessed until the legal fees alone plunged him into personal bankruptcy. The execution was flawless. Sterling delivered the fatal blow with the precision we had discussed by the fireplace. He tossed the black folder onto the nearest glass table. Turning his back on Derek without awaiting a response, the veteran investor headed towards the heavy oak front doors. He did not look back. His departure signified the official conclusion of the launch party. The remaining venture capitalists and tech founders read the room. They were highly intelligent individuals who understood the toxic nature of legal exposure. Being present at a party hosted by a man currently facing federal indictment and an impending civil lawsuit was a liability none of them could afford. The exodus commenced. Guests placed their half-empty champagne flutes on any available surface. Crystal glasses clinked against marble tables and wooden sideboards. The socialites gathered their designer coats and expensive clutch purses, averting their eyes from the man sweating in the center of the sunken living room. The young founders who moments ago had admired Derek now hurried past him, treating him as if he were an infectious disease. The string quartet musicians packed their instruments into their velvet-lined cases, snapping the latches shut with a loud finality. The caterers quietly retreated into the kitchen, abandoning the trays of hors d'oeuvres. The Grand Faux Chateau, which had been buzzing with the energy of false prosperity just 10 minutes prior, was rapidly emptying. I remained on the stairs, observing the exodus. A profound sense of lightness washed over me. The heavy weight of the last 48 hours had been lifted from my shoulders. The $650,000 house was safe. The shady life had been exposed. The scam was over before it even began. Derek stood alone among the discarded black folders. He ran a trembling hand over his face, his eyes darting frantically around the room, watching his entire carefully crafted reality disappear through the front door. He looked at me on the stairs. He looked like a man who had stepped off a cliff, finally realizing there was no safety net below. When the room was empty, leaving behind only the wreckage of a ruined party, the heavy oak doors slammed shut. The standoff wasn't over with the last investor gone. The venture capitalists had fled to protect their portfolios, but the architects who held the rights to them remained. From the front row at the foot of the stairs, a new, barely audible sound emanated, the sharp, angry click of designer heels on the marble floor. Susan and Richard were pushing their way through the empty space left by the fleeing guests. The wealthy investor had abandoned the sinking ship, but Derek's parents were too immersed in the illusion to leave. They had sanctioned the theft. They had spent the stolen $50,000. They were cornered. Susan marched towards the staircase, her face contorted in a mask of righteous indignation. She bypassed her sweating, ruined son and fixed her furious gaze entirely on me. The enablers were preparing their counterattack, demanding a scapegoat for the collapse of their golden boy. I adjusted my posture, smoothing the lapels of my navy suit, gripping the microphone a little tighter. The public dismantling of my husband was complete, but the eradication of the family corruption was just beginning. The heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing the fate of the launch party. The venture capitalists were gone, taking their checkbooks and their prestige with them. Only the local socialites remained. These were the country club elite, people who thrived on scandal, as long as it belonged to someone else. They lingered near the catered buffets and floral arrangements, pretending to look for their coats, while their eyes remained glued to the unfolding disaster in the grand foyer. From the center of the sunken living room, the clicking of designer heels echoed like a metronome, ticking towards and detonation. Susan marched towards the grand staircase. Richard trailed half a step behind her. Susan did not look at her son. Derek was kneeling on the floor, frantically attempting to gather the scattered presentation folders, as if reassembling the paper could somehow mend his shattered reality. Susan ignored him entirely. Her fury was directed upward, locked onto me. Susan had spent her entire adult life cultivating an image of effortless superiority. She served on the boards of local charities, hosted galas, and treated people in the service industry as invisible machinery. For 6 years, she had categorized me in that same vein. I was the reliable operations manager, the background utility that allowed her son to shine. In her mind, my sole purpose was to facilitate the greatness of her family. Stripping that greatness away in front of her peers was the ultimate unforgivable sin. She stopped at the base of the stairs, her silk dress rustling as she planted her feet. Her face was contorted, the refined mask slipping to reveal the raw entitlement beneath. She pointed a manicured finger at me. She did not whisper. She projected her voice so every remaining guest in the foyer could hear her defense. She called me ungrateful. She claimed I was staging a hysterical, jealous performance because I could not handle being married to a man whose intellect surpassed my own. She labeled the documents in the black folders as fabricated trash. She turned toward the remaining guests and declared that I had always been unstable, bitter, vindictive. According to Susan, I was trying to destroy my brilliant husband out of jealousy and spite. Then she demanded I step down from the staircase and publicly apologize to Derek and the entire family for humiliating them. I looked down at her calmly, and I said nothing. I let her continue. I let her bury herself deeper with every sentence. Each accusation was another shovel of dirt thrown onto her own grave. Beside her, Richard shifted nervously, finally noticing the expression spreading across the room. Wealthy friends, investors, socialites, watching, judging. He reached for Susan's elbow in a weak attempt to calm her down, but she snapped his hand away immediately. Then she doubled down. Because Susan still believed I would crack under public pressure. She believed shame would force me into silence. She was catastrophically wrong. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I did not explain my actions. Arguments only exist when two people still share the same version of reality. I was not there to negotiate reality. I was there to finish the execution. Slowly, I reached into the pocket of my navy blazer and pulled out my phone. My thumb unlocked the screen and opened the secure cloud storage app. I selected the audio recording I captured less than 24 hours earlier, while hidden inside the dark pantry of that very house. Then I raised the volume to maximum. I lifted the wireless microphone toward the phone speaker and looked directly into Susan's furious eyes, and I pressed play. A brief crackle of digital static echoed through the mansion's sound system. Then came the unmistakable sound of ice clinking against crystal. Richard's voice filled the foyer first. Nervous, uneasy, asking about the $50,000 wire transfer. Asking whether Kat would discover the real estate transfer before closing. Shock rippled visibly through the remaining guests. Conversations died instantly. The entire room went silent. Richard froze in place as the color drained from his face. He recognized his own voice immediately. Then Susan's voice echoed through the vaulted ceilings. Cold, sharp, perfectly clear. She's his wife. Her assets belong to the family. He did what he had to do with that paperwork. The $50,000 is our rightful share. I stopped the recording. Silence returned. But it was no longer ordinary silence. It was the suffocating silence that follows total social annihilation. I lowered the microphone slowly while maintaining perfect posture. Susan's face had gone completely pale. One manicured hand hovered uselessly in the air, trembling slightly. The righteous outrage vanished from her expression, replaced by pure terror. Because her private entitlement had just been broadcast to every influential person she spent years trying to impress. She opened her mouth to speak. Nothing came out. There was no defense left. Not only had she admitted knowledge of the stolen money, she had openly justified federal fraud in front of the entire room. The reaction was immediate and brutal. These people tolerated quiet corruption. They ignored discreet financial misconduct, but sloppy, documented criminal behavior? That violated the rules of their world. One by one, the socialites physically stepped backward. Not dramatically, subtly, collectively. Like synchronized revulsion. A prominent philanthropist Susan had spent years desperately trying to impress, turned around without saying a single word and walked directly toward the coat check. Two men who regularly played golf with Richard exchanged a glance before heading silently for the exit. Nobody offered sympathy, nobody defended them, nobody moved closer. Inside the ruthless hierarchy of elite society, Susan and Richard had just become radioactive. Minutes earlier, they were the proud parents of a visionary founder. Now they were exposed as co-conspirators in a pathetic fraud operation built on theft and desperation. And I watched their empire collapse in real time. For years, I endured the insults, the condescension, the endless assumption that my work, my income, and my resources existed to support their lifestyle. To them, I had never been a person, only fuel. Now, standing inside the ruins of their rented fantasy, they had nothing left. The stolen $50,000 would be recovered during litigation. Their retirement accounts had already been gutted by their son, and their social standing, the only thing they truly valued, had just been permanently erased. Near the sunken living room, Derrick remained on his knees, clutching several black presentation folders against his chest. He looked toward his parents and finally understood the full scale of the destruction. I had not simply destroyed his startup. I had destroyed the system protecting him. No wealthy parents left to rescue him. No country club connections willing to quietly cover legal fees. No carefully curated network. For the first time in his life, Derrick Garcia stood completely alone. I turned away from the foyer. I did not wait for apologies. I did not care about tears. I climbed the remaining stairs toward the second-floor landing, searching for somewhere quiet before leaving the estate. The financial bleeding had stopped. The evidence had been deployed. The targets had been neutralized. But one final procedural consequence was still unfolding. The trap Valerie and I set in the coffee shop the night before was already moving through the system. Jason signed the confession. But more importantly, he chose self-preservation. The wire fraud had already been flagged across multiple jurisdictions. As I reached the top of the staircase, I heard the faint sound of tires rolling slowly across the stone driveway outside. Consequences had arrived, and Derrick had nowhere left to run. Movies teach people to expect destruction to arrive loudly. Sirens, flashing red and blue lights, police officers storming through doors while reading rights to a broken criminal. Real financial and social ruin works differently. Real ruin is quiet. It sounds like oak doors closing softly behind people who will never answer your calls again. It sounds like investors deleting your number from their phones. It sounds like an entire manufactured life evaporating in silence. The grand foyer of the fake chateau felt hollow now. Earlier, the air had buzzed with expensive perfume, champagne, and artificial excitement. Now it smelled stale, dead. The investors were gone. They took their money and their status with them. The catering staff recognized the collapse instantly. Unlike the wealthy guests, they lived in the real world. The head chef emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a white apron before giving a short nod to his staff. Immediately, the servers stopped circulating hors d'oeuvres. Then they began dismantling the buffet stations with efficient indifference. Metal trays clattered against marble floors. Untouched gourmet food disappeared into heavy black trash bags. Expensive wine was poured directly down industrial sinks. Nobody approached Derrick for instructions. Nobody asked him to sign invoices. They already understood the truth. The money no longer existed. So they focused only on salvaging rental equipment and leaving the property as quickly as possible. Near the entrance, the string quartet packed their instruments in complete silence. The cellist lowered his instrument into a velvet-lined case and snapped the brass locks shut. The metallic click echoed sharply through the emptying foyer, like a judge striking a gavel. One by one, the musicians lifted their black instrument cases and exited through the service doors without even glancing at the ruined host. Susan and Richard still stood near the base of the staircase. The recording of their voices seemed permanently embedded in the walls around them. The truth had stripped away every layer of status they once hid behind. Susan stared blankly ahead, posture rigid. An hour earlier, her silk designer dress looked elegant. Now it looked theatrical, cheap, like a costume worn by someone pretending to belong in a world that had finally rejected her. She never looked at her son, never comforted him, never defended him. For decades, Susan shaped Derrick into a polished instrument for her own social ambitions. She excused his failures and financed his delusions because his success reflected positively on her. But now, the illusion was broken. Publicly. And once the tool stopped being useful, she discarded it instantly, without hesitation. Richard adjusted the collar of his jacket and cleared his throat awkwardly. The sound echoed loudly through the thinning room. Then he placed a hand lightly against Susan's elbow and guided her toward the exit. They moved slowly, like sleepwalkers, drained of arrogance, drained of pride. And as they crossed the foyer, they walked directly past Derek without stopping once. Derek stood alone in the middle of the foyer, surrounded by scattered black presentation folders. He stretched one hand toward his parents as they moved toward the exit. "Mom." His voice cracked under the weight of his collapsing world. Susan never turned around. Instead, she pulled her arm closer against her side, avoiding his outstretched hand as though contact with him might contaminate her. Her eyes remained fixed on the heavy oak doors ahead. Richard kept his head lowered, unable to look directly at the ruins of the legacy he helped create. The doors opened. Cold night air swept briefly through the foyer. Then the doors closed again with a soft, final click. The enablers had retreated to the safety of their leased luxury car, abandoning their golden child to face the consequences alone. I stood on the second-floor landing watching the entire scene unfold beneath me. Watching the man I married 6 years earlier finally understand what isolation felt like. Slowly, Derek lowered his arm. His tailored suit was wrinkled now. The expensive fabric hung awkwardly across slumped shoulders, no longer capable of performing confidence. In one hand, he still held a crystal champagne flute. Earlier that evening, condensation coated the glass with icy elegance. Now the drink inside was warm, flat, and useless, just like the illusion he built around himself. He looked around the cavernous foyer. The rented chateau mocked him. He leased the mansion to project status, power, wealth. He wanted venture capitalists to believe he belonged among them. Now the soaring ceilings and empty halls only magnified his insignificance. Finally, he looked up. His eyes found me standing above him in the shadows near the staircase landing. And something inside him shifted. The panic was gone. The frantic scrambling had burned away completely, leaving behind nothing but hollow realization. I watched the final calculations happen behind his eyes. No venture capital funding, no startup, no access to the $650,000 frozen behind legal affidavits and criminal filings. His parents were gone. His investors were gone. His audience was gone. The fraud had been stripped down to its skeleton. I placed one hand on the smooth wooden railing and began descending the staircase. My heels struck the marble in slow, measured rhythm. I did not rush. I walked with the calm certainty of someone reclaiming stolen territory. Derek watched me approach with wide, empty eyes. He looked like a man standing inside the ashes of a burned city trying to understand how the fire spread so quickly. I reached the final step and crossed the foyer toward him. Then I stopped exactly 2 feet away. He opened his mouth immediately, searching, desperate, trying to find a lie capable of repairing the damage, an apology, a promise, a manipulation. For 6 years, those tactics carried him through every failure. But Valerie and I had dismantled every possible escape route. The intern's confession destroyed his legal defense. The audio recording destroyed his family alliance. The frozen title transfer destroyed his financial exit. There was nowhere left for him to run. He swallowed hard and closed his mouth again. Silence stretched between us. Heavy. Permanent. I was still holding the wireless microphone in my right hand. The device had served its purpose. It amplified the truth and shattered the illusion. I lifted my arm and extended the microphone toward him. Derek stared blankly at the black handle for a second before instinctively taking it from my hand. His fingers brushed mine briefly. His skin felt damp and cold. I looked at the warm champagne in his other hand, the sweat stains darkening the collar of his expensive white shirt. Then I spoke with complete emotional detachment. Like an operations manager closing a failed account. I told him the lease on the mansion was entirely in his name. Then I suggested he enjoy the weekend. That was the final blow. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on him. And with that single movement, the last thread connecting our marriage finally snapped. I walked toward the front entrance, leaving him standing among abandoned catering trays and scattered presentation folders. The heavy oak doors felt almost weightless as I pushed them open and stepped outside into the cold October night. Valerie waited on the front portico beneath the warm glow of the exterior lights. Her leather tote hung over one shoulder while crisp autumn air swept through the estate grounds. I inhaled deeply. For the first time in years, my lungs felt clear. No perfume, no lies, no manipulation, only relief. Valerie offered me a small nod. No dramatic speeches, no questions about my emotions. She already knew the mission was complete. Together, we walked down the stone staircase and away from the estate. Our vehicles waited farther down the street beyond the circular driveway. I stopped beside her car and thanked her for everything. Her forensic expertise, her strategy, her precision. I told her I could never have dismantled the network without her help. She nodded once and said she would monitor the legal filings and corporate accounts Monday morning. Then she climbed into her black sedan and disappeared into the night. I unlocked my practical sedan and settled behind the wheel. The dashboard lights glowed softly inside the dark cabin as the engine turned over. The drive back to Wilmington felt strangely peaceful. Empty roads, streetlights casting long rhythmic shadows across wet pavement. The social execution was complete. But one final defensive move still remained. Derek was in shock now. Eventually, shock would fade, and when it did, he would remember the only real asset left in his life. My house. He would try to come back. I needed to secure the perimeter before sunrise. The social war had ended. The procedural war was about to begin. I pressed harder on the accelerator and headed toward the city. Before dawn, I needed a locksmith, new security codes, and complete control over the property. By morning, I intended to sit peacefully in my kitchen drinking coffee, while reality arrived at my front door. Sunrise spread across Wilmington in muted shades of slate gray and pale gold. I stood alone in my kitchen holding a ceramic coffee mug, letting warmth seep slowly into my hands. The house was silent. No pacing. No rehearsed startup pitches echoing through phone calls. Only the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional settling creak of floorboards. I looked around the kitchen carefully. Granite countertops. Custom cabinetry. Morning light spilling through the bay window. Every inch of the property existed because of 8 relentless years of 50-hour work weeks. This sanctuary belonged to me. At exactly 7 o'clock, a white utility van rolled into the driveway. I opened the front door and greeted the locksmith with prepaid paperwork and clear instructions. He specialized in corporate evictions. Fast, quiet, professional. He asked no questions. He simply opened his toolbox and started working. I watched him remove the brass lock plates and old cylinders shaped by Derek's keys. The process took 22 minutes. When the new deadbolt finally slid into the reinforced frame with a heavy metallic clack, it sounded like a bank vault sealing shut. I paid him in cash. Thanked him. Watched him drive away. The perimeter was secure. I brewed another pot of dark roast coffee and listened to the steady drip of the machine filling the silence. At 8:15, the low growl of a luxury engine interrupted the quiet morning. I moved carefully into the living room and positioned myself beside the large picture window where I could observe the porch without being seen. Derek's leased German sedan parked crookedly near the curb. He stepped out slowly. He had not changed clothes, still wearing the white dress shirt and tailored slacks from the destroyed launch party. But now the fabric was wrinkled beyond repair. His dark silk tie, the one I tied for him less than 24 hours earlier, hung loose and crooked around his neck. He walked toward the house, dragging his feet. The arrogance that once carried him through every room had completely disappeared. All that remained was exhaustion. He climbed the porch steps and reached into his pocket for his keys. Then he inserted the familiar brass key into the lock. Turned it confidently. Nothing. The key jammed. He frowned and tried again. Still nothing. He jiggled the handle and pushed his shoulder against the reinforced door. The house did not move. Slowly, realization spread across his face. He stepped backward and looked up at the address numbers beside the doorframe like a man questioning whether he had arrived at the wrong house. Then he stepped forward again and knocked. Weakly, at first. "Cat?" His voice sounded rough and exhausted through the thick wood. When I did not respond, the knocking became louder, then desperate. He pounded the flat of his hand against the door and begged me to open it. Said we needed to talk. Needed to discuss strategy. Needed to fix things. Even now, he still believed his words had value inside my home. I stood silently in the shadows of the living room and took another slow sip of coffee. I felt no anger. No need for revenge. No desire for apologies. Responding to him would mean acknowledging his importance. So I let him knock. 10 minutes later, a generic silver sedan turned slowly onto my street. When you spend your life being the dependable one, the person who pays the bills, solves the problems, and keeps everything from collapsing, it becomes dangerously easy to mistake endurance for strength. You start believing peace is something you must purchase with silence. You convince yourself that ignoring warning signs is simply part of building a future with someone. But there is a difference between supporting a person and subsidizing their destruction. There is a difference between loyalty and self-erasure. For years, I believed stability meant sacrifice. I believed love meant carrying more weight, absorbing more stress, forgiving more failures. I told myself that if I worked harder, stayed calmer, and remained patient enough, eventually the chaos around me would settle into something solid. Instead, my silence became infrastructure for someone else's entitlement. Every ignored red flag became permission. Every financial rescue became expectation. Every compromise became another brick in a system designed to drain me while convincing me I was lucky to participate in it. The hardest lesson was realizing betrayal rarely arrives wearing the face of open cruelty. Sometimes betrayal smiles at you across a kitchen island. Sometimes it kisses your cheek before asking for another favor. Sometimes it calls exploitation partnership and theft family support. What saved me was not revenge. It was documentation. It was preparation. It was the moment I stopped arguing emotionally and started responding strategically. People like Derek survive because they rely on exhaustion. They depend on confusion, guilt, and social pressure to keep their victims passive long enough for the damage to become irreversible. The moment you stop reacting emotionally and start treating manipulation like a logistical problem, the balance of power changes immediately. That was the real turning point. Not the lawsuit, not the public collapse, not the criminal investigation. The real turning point happened the second I accepted a simple truth. I was never obligated to keep setting myself on fire to keep other people warm. Now the house is quiet. The walls are painted colors I actually chose. The locks belong to me. The title belongs to me. The future belongs to me. And for the first time in years, peace inside this home is not something I perform for other people. It is real. You become so accustomed to carrying the weight of everything that eventually you forget you are allowed to set it down. Derek and his family weaponized my reliability. They did not view my stability as a partnership. They viewed it as a resource to extract. They mistook my silence for blindness. They assumed that because I played the role of the supportive wife, I would willingly become collateral damage for Derek's delusions of grandeur. They were wrong. Being the quiet peacekeeper is not a virtue when it costs your self-respect. Loyalty is a mutual agreement, not an unlimited line of credit. And family, whether through blood or marriage, is never a justification for exploitation. If there is one lesson hidden inside my story, it is this: do not confuse your ability to endure pain with an obligation to tolerate abuse. You are allowed to question inconsistencies. You are allowed to open locked drawers. You are allowed to collect evidence. You are allowed to document the truth. And you are absolutely allowed to defend your boundaries with ruthless precision. If someone treats your boundaries like suggestions, then their place in your life should be treated as a privilege, one that can be revoked at any moment. I am 35 years old. I am an operations manager who understands the value of a meticulous audit trail. I exposed federal fraud. I dismantled a toxic family structure. I protected my financial future. And I accomplished all of it without screaming matches or dramatic breakdowns. I did it with evidence, facts, documentation, strategy. I look around my living room now, watching warm terracotta paint dry over the cold industrial gray Derek insisted on keeping for years. He said gray looked modern. I always thought it looked lifeless. Now the room feels grounded, warm, human. The scent of fresh paint lingers in the air like proof of a beginning instead of an ending. I lift my coffee mug and take another slow sip. The house is quiet. The legal battles no longer belong to me. My future does. And finally, the paint is drying. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If you understand the power of setting a hard boundary and reclaiming your self-respect, I want to hear your story too. Tell me about the moment you stopped being everyone else's safety net and started protecting your own peace. You are not alone. And if this story resonated with you, stay tuned. There are always more stories waiting behind closed doors. Until next time, remember this: your worth is not measured by how much suffering you can absorb for other people. Protect your peace. Take care of yourself. Most people see stories about betrayal, fraud, and financial ruin as dramatic exceptions, the kind of disasters reserved for movies and headlines. But Kat and Derek's story is not really about a forged deed or a stolen house. At its core, it is about modern values. Strip away the fraud, the revenge, and the courtroom fallout, and what remains is a brutal reflection of how ambition, entitlement, and emotional dependency quietly corrode families from the inside out. The collapse of Derek's life was not caused by one bad decision. It was the cumulative result of years of moral compromise disguised as ambition. That is the real warning embedded in this story. It forces uncomfortable questions. How do we define success? What kind of behavior do we reward? What values are we quietly teaching our children through our actions? In today's culture, especially in high-pressure startup environments, image often matters more than substance. People are taught to sell confidence before competence, to fake it until they make it, to project success long before they have earned it. Derek built his entire identity around that illusion: the rented mansion, the polished presentations, the buzzwords, the luxury image. Every piece of it existed to distract people from the truth. He was drowning. Real intelligence is not the ability to sound visionary. Real intelligence is the ability to separate fantasy from reality before fantasy destroys your life. That lesson matters deeply inside relationships and families. Parents must teach children the difference between sustainable effort and performative ambition. Not every dream deserves blind support. Not every charismatic person deserves trust. And not every relationship deserves endless sacrifice. Another hard truth exposed by this story is that silence is not always strength. Many people are conditioned to believe endurance is noble. Stay patient, stay supportive, keep the peace. But emotional maturity also means recognizing when a situation has become destructive. Healthy boundaries are not cruelty, they are survival. Love should never require self-erasure. Perhaps the darkest part of the entire story was not Derek's fraud, but the involvement of his parents. Susan and Richard normalized entitlement for years. Instead of teaching accountability, they protected ego. Instead of encouraging integrity, they rewarded manipulation. By accepting stolen money and justifying forgery, they exposed a dangerous moral failure that exists in many families: the belief that protecting the family image matters more than protecting the truth. But loyalty without integrity becomes corruption. A healthy family should not function like a shield for wrongdoing. It should function like a compass. Children learn morality long before adulthood. They absorb it from dinner table conversations, financial habits, emotional behavior, and the way parents justify bad actions. If children are taught that appearances matter more than honesty, they grow into adults who fear failure so deeply that they will lie, manipulate, and even destroy others to preserve the illusion of success. That is how people like Derek are created. And finally, there is resilience. Not the loud, dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that allows someone to face betrayal without collapsing into chaos. Kat's strength did not come from screaming or revenge fantasies. It came from discipline, preparation, evidence, control. She faced the truth directly and responded with precision instead of panic. That is real resilience. At the same time, true resilience also requires the courage to admit failure. Modern culture teaches people to fear failure as humiliation, but refusing to accept failure often creates something far worse: fraud, deception, desperation. Real strength is the ability to fail honestly, rebuild ethically, and continue forward without sacrificing your character. That is the lesson families should pass down: not perfection, not image, integrity. Because no lasting life can ever be built on deception. Eventually, reality collects its debt. The final lesson is simple: protect your boundaries, question inconsistencies, pay attention to behavior instead of promises, and remember that access to your life is a privilege, not an entitlement. Peace does not come from luxury houses or carefully curated appearances. Peace comes from knowing your life is built on truth. Look closely at the people around you. Look at the values quietly being passed between generations. Look at the boundaries being respected or ignored. Ask yourself whether the foundation beneath you is solid or whether it is simply waiting for pressure to expose the cracks. Because sometimes the collapse does not begin with one catastrophic event. Sometimes it begins with years of tolerated dishonesty hidden behind beautiful walls.